All right, Donald Trump has defeated Hillary Clinton in the race to become the president of the United States. What does this mean for India? To understand what it does mean for India, today on BloombergQuint, I am joined by Shyam Saran, who's obviously the former Foreign Secretary of India. He's also currently a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and the chairman of RIS. Mr. Saran, thank you so much for joining us on BloombergQuint. I'd like to start by asking you, Mr. Saran, now, so much has been, spoken about during this election campaign, and all of us in India, thousands of miles away, have really been glued into this election. What does this mean for us when it comes to bilateral relations with the United States?
First of all, I think the good news is that relations with India, strengthening relations with India is something which has for quite some time enjoyed a bipartisan consensus in the United States. So both Republican administrations as well as Democratic administrations have been very supportive of a stronger relationship with India. And I do not see that consensus in any way being impacted adversely as a result of the Trump presidency. But yes, there could be some negative consequences. For example, if Trump really follows through on his anti-immigration policy or his policy in terms of protecting US jobs, then obviously there could be some impact, say, on India's services exports, like its IT exports. But I think we will have to wait and see.
So also, in terms of all the political rhetoric in the build-up to this election, often what's said in the run-up to elections doesn't always translate into the same things when you're in office. But so much was said about China, and I think it's important that we bring up China because, even when it comes to climate change, he seems to claim it was a hoax by the Chinese, and we didn't get any specific policy standpoints from him. So is that a concern, considering we're so close to China out here?
Well, as far as the issue of climate change is concerned, I think the major issue is going to be whether or not Trump follows through on some of the rather progressive policies on energy, on climate change, which Obama had pursued. It would appear that Trump is not very enthusiastic about these policies. So what does it mean, for example, with respect to the implementation of the very historic Paris Agreement? If the US is not going to be really delivering on its commitments under the Paris Agreement, that agreement could quite as well unravel. And that would be bad news for us. With regard to China, I think there are two issues. One is that there are obviously security tensions between the two major powers, but at the same time you have the picture of two economies which are perhaps more integrated with each other than any other two economies. So they are joined at the hip in a sense. The US-China trade is almost $1 trillion or more. So if there is going to be an impact on that trade, which really causes considerable economic dislocation and harm to the Chinese economy, which is very heavily dependent upon the US market because of protectionist policies, because of the kind of sentiments that have been expressed by Mr. Trump. On the one hand, this could exacerbate the security issues. It would add an economic dimension to the rivalry which we already see. But on the other hand, if Mr. Trump, also delivers on what is seen as a retreat from the alliance systems that the US has been leading in Europe, in East Asia, then that would create more space for China. Because one of the problems that we face in terms of security in the region is that China believes that it has a natural entitlement to be the top dog in the region, and that this is somehow being prevented by the United States of America. And United States of America working together with countries like Japan, India, Australia, Southeast Asian countries. Therefore, if there is really a retreat by the United States from the region, or even a relative retreat, this may not be unwelcome to China. And of course, this may not mean for us a very happy development either, because this would mean that the Chinese challenge for India will be that much more complex, that much more difficult to cope with.
Interesting, Mr. Saran. Also, another key point that I must bring up, and you spoke about China, is also Pakistan. Because we've seen in his campaign, and that's the only yardstick that we have to judge, that he does want to clamp down on terrorism. And we know that Pakistan is a hotbed of terrorism, and that region really is. And considering Indo-Pak ties and the way, you know, the whole relationship has panned out over the years between India, Pakistan and the United States, do you think that would change considerably?
Well, you know, I see a Pakistani threat to India more as a subset of the Chinese threat. I do not see Pakistan itself, despite its indulgence in cross-border terrorism, as an elemental threat to the survival of India or to the security of India. If as a result of Mr. Trump's new policies towards China, the Chinese-Pakistani relationship or alliance comes under greater pressure,
right,
that would not be unwelcome to India. But let me conclude by saying that, you know, dealing with Pakistan and managing the Pakistani relationship is something that we will have to do ourselves rather than depend on the United States of America or any other power. This is something that we have to deal with ourselves.
Mr. Saran, as a last question, since we were talking about the region, now with the campaign, we saw a lot of talk on nuclear issues, and with, you know, you've worked extensively with the Prime Minister's office on nuclear matters in the past. What I'd like to ask you is, Mr. Saran, that when you consider the kind of things that were said by his opponents, saying this is a gentleman who you wouldn't want anywhere near the nuclear codes, you know, and the kind of ramifications that it could actually have for the world. And also, he actually mentioned that he would scrap the Iran nuclear deal as well, and there's a host of other reasons backing that up. But do you think that this could have any sort of impact closer back home?
No, I do not believe that you know, these sort of apprehensions that somehow Trump is like a madman and you know, a strange Glavian kind of a figure, and who should be kept away from nuclear weapons. I do not think that is a correct you know, portrayal of the man. He is obviously very ultra right. He has very strong opinions, but I do not think that he is a madman, you know. And I think the United States of America is a very mature political democracy with very well-established institutions, also has very strong institutions with respect to, you know, the safety and security of its nuclear weapons. There are very elaborate drills in terms of, you know, how and when such weapons could be used. So on that score, I do not have a apprehension that we are somehow going to be seeing a nuclear you know, holocaust sometime in the future. But yes, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. There have been many people in the United States of America and certainly Israel which think that this was a bad deal. I personally believe it was a good deal because it prevented a armed confrontation in the region, which would have exacerbated the already very sharp tensions that we see. Now, will Mr. Trump follow up on that? Again, remains to be seen. From what I see in terms of post-election posture that he has been adopting, there is obviously a very conscious attempt to project himself as a very reasonable, reassuring, cautious figure, and we hope that that is the persona which we'll see more of rather than the personas which we saw during the election campaign.
Super, Mr. Anand. Thank you so much for such a candid chat. Thank you.
My pleasure.